Um, So I believe we can start. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you all for taking out the time out of your busy schedule, students. Today's informative session, Advocacy in Action, Building Capacity and Advancing Key Issues. Your presence here reflects your commitment to strengthening advocacy efforts within our communities, and we are truly glad to have you with us. For those who may not know me, I'm Kuratulan. I'm the Executive Assistant and the Membership Coordinator at the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, and it's pleasure to welcome our members and staff in this important learning. Before we start this session, I just want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and the recording, along with the presentation slides and relevant resources, will be shared with all the participants after the session. Um, I will just give you a quick summary about the training. So this training is designed to support local organizations and activists in advocating for impactful policies on gender, mental health, anti-racism, and beyond at all levels of government and towards communities in Canada. Drawing on Action Canada's federal policy and advocacy experience, the training will provide practical tips, tools, and strategies to help you effectively engage with policymakers, opposition parties, government officials, and local grassroots communities to advance your organization initiatives. It's now my pleasure to introduce our facilitator, Insiya Mankani, the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. Insiya helps advance the sexual and reproductive health policy landscape in Canada by working closely with parliamentarians, policymakers, and community organizations to promote sexual and reproductive health, equitable access to services, and strengthen rights for marginalized and underserved population. Before joining Action Canada, she served at Human Rights Watch as the Senior Advocacy and Development Coordinator, supporting international human rights initiatives and advocacy campaigns. Based in Ottawa, Ontario, Insiya is committed to advancing human rights, health equity, and systemic changes through policy, advocacy, and collaboration. We are grateful to have you with us today, and Insiya, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Kurt, are you still able to share the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So once we get the slides up, I'll just get it, while we're getting the slides up, I'll get into a bit of an introduction about myself. As Kurt mentioned, my name is Insiya, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. I've been working with Action Canada since 2022. And prior to this role, I was with Human Rights Watch Canada as the Senior Coordinator for Advocacy and Development. I'm also a South Asian. I am an immigrant. I'm a child of immigrants. My family is originally from Pakistan, and I grew up between Toronto and Dubai. Um, and I'm a local feminist and an anti-racist advocate. So this work really is very core to my personality as well. So a little bit about Action Canada. Um, Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights is a national organization championing sexual and reproductive health and rights both in Canada and around the world. We also hold the Planned Parenthood Federation name. So, as the Planned Parenthood Federation of Canada, we work closely with our network of sexual health centers who deliver care to communities across the country. Collectively, they serve hundreds of thousands of Canadians. Our team runs programs used by thousands of Canadians every year to connect sexual and reproductive health services. Specifically, our access line that in just the last year supported 4,100 callers, 50% of whom faced major barriers to accessing abortion services, and a significant portion of whom were also immigrants. The work we do gives us invaluable insights into who does and does not get the care they need and what it looks like in real terms. And we use these insights to inform policy, and we also use these insights in our thought leadership on the issue to inform how we show up in our coalition work. So for the agenda today, the presentation should be around an hour, and this will leave time for a Q&A at the end. Initially, I had planned breakout session activities, but I think we'll just stay together as a group and do these as a larger group in the interest of time and to work closer together. For the learning objectives, if we can just go to the next slide. Um,
Insiya, can you control it from your side?
no, I'm not able to control it. I think you have to give me the. Oh, perfect. Oh, sorry. Takes a second. So for the learning objectives, um, the learning objectives of the training today are to understand the difference between behind the scenes tactics, so government relations work and advocacy, what that looks like, and what that looks like in terms of public facing initiatives such as advocacy campaigns, and when it's helpful to combine the two. So, learning about key decision makers at the provincial and territorial level to frame advocacy strategically and to identify practical ways to engage elected officials and policymakers. And this is part of our larger effort that Action Canada is part of to build for capacity building amongst our partners to ensure all of you can do advocacy. Because as we know, in order for everyone to live strong sexual and reproductive health and have strong reproductive health, they must have healthy lives and full lives as well. And all of you contribute to our advocacy efforts as well. So this is part of our capacity building efforts. Um, so moving on to section 1. In this section, we're really looking to understand the difference between behind the scenes tactics, so government relations, and public facing initiatives, so the advocacy campaigns, um, and when those two intersect. So, advocacy is about taking action to create change, and advocacy can be aimed at the state or government to enact law and policy change. It can also be used to transform social norms and foster supportive context for policy implementation. What does that really mean? So, advocacy is key to upholding for Action Canada sexual and reproductive health and for many other policies as well. It leads to long-term policy and legal reforms essential for the realization of human rights. And advocacy is critical to counter regressions and rising attacks on SRHR, on immigration, on mental health, and a number of the issues that we've seen come across for partner organizations. As the most affected by SRHR context, feminist movements, including youth-led organizations and women's rights organizations and immigrant organizations, are the drivers of progress, accountability, and people-centered policies at the local, national, regional, and global levels. Organizations such as yourselves know best what people within our communities need. And that is what we're trying to address with policymakers. So, by working in coalitions, partnerships, and transnational alliances, feminist movements surface demands that take into account the differentiated ways change is needed to address the systemic barriers faced by diverse communities. Feminist advocacy has been essential to integrating general health as a central tenet of human rights. Um, the reason this advocacy is so important is because we need to be central to the discussion that we're having. We cannot be having these discussions without being involved in the talks. For SRHR specifically, for example, the work we do, we know this needs to be a priority. We know these needs are often stigmatized, and the stigma often leads to an active deprioritization by governments and decision makers. This is similar with mental health. This is similar with community housing. Our advocacy leads to change. Advocacy that engages from the local to national to international level is required to galvanize and sustain political and normative change. And our advocacy facilitates and connects changes across all of these levels. So, starting from the grassroots, working all the way up to the federal level, we want to see cohesive policies. And advocacy addresses root causes. Advocacy, and particularly grassroots and feminist advocacy, is well placed to identify and challenge systemic barriers and to advance sustainable and human rights-based solutions. And because advocacy supports an active and vibrant civil society. So, civil society organizations defend collective interests and increase accountability, promote participation from different communities, directly engage in community service, and challenge prejudice. A free and pluralistic civil society is a necessary part of a healthy and functioning democracy. And it is often women of color, people of color, immigrants, marginalized populations that are left out of these discussions. So, national versus provincial advocacy, as we are an SRHR organization, many of my examples may be specific to SRHR. However, they can be applied in a more broader context. And as we go on, it does get a bit more general as well. So, working on any advocacy issues in Canada means navigating jurisdiction. What is federal versus what is provincial versus what is municipal? For Action Canada's work, for example, the Canadian Health Act is held federally with health transfers to the provinces. Provinces implement the Canadian Health Act through the expenditure of healthcare transfers from the feds, but health itself is under provincial jurisdiction. So for specific healthcare changes, it would have to be provincial advocacy, while anything that is implemented through the Canada Health Act is federal advocacy. So you need to know who to advocate and for what. Action Canada focuses federally largely. So we have something called the Abortion Access Tracker, we have something called the Contraception Atlas, and that shows what the differences look like province to province. And we use these tools to take them federally to show the differences across the country so that there can be one federal implementation. However, this is also helpful for our provincial partners to take to their provincial governments to show where each province falls in relation to each other. Our government relations remains primarily federal, and our goals with coalition partners are to build the capacity of regional advocates to do government relations and advocacy provincially and in collaboration with us. So for so for government, Canada has three levels of government, as you can see here. There's federal, provincial or territorial, and then you have the municipal. So your city, town, village, country, region, so on. Um, Other elements of governance in Canada are also that aren't included here are First Nations governance. Across the country, band councils govern First Nations communities, and band councils are similar to municipal governments. Band members elect the band council, which make decisions that affect their local communities. That one isn't as discussed here, but if anyone has specific questions about Indigenous advocacy separately, I'm happy to address that in the Q&A. So for parliamentary democracy, at the federal level, Parliament has three parts. There is the sovereign, which is the king or queen, that acts through the governor general at the federal level. And then you have the two houses, which are the Senate and the House of Commons. The Senate, as it is not elected, is largely a rubber stamp in a way. Um, so for the Senate, when we're looking at this, and for the House of Commons, when we're looking at this, as bills pass through, they either have to go from the Senate to the House of Commons or the House of Commons to the Senate, but they need to have approval from both houses before they go to the sovereign or the Governor General for approval for all laws. Canadian citizens elect political representatives at all three levels of parliament. So you have federal elections, you have provincial elections, and then you have municipal elections. Elected representatives at the municipal level would hold city council positions, for example. Provincial would be your MLAs or MPPs or members of provincial parliament or members of legislative assembly. And then at the federal level, it would be your members of parliament at the House of Commons. So their duties include passing laws, approving and monitoring spending, and keeping the government accountable. They do this through statements in the House, they do this through committees, they do this through private members' bills. So there are a number of ways to have them engage. And one of my favorite ones to use, for example, is through petitions. So not a lot of people know this, and it is different for each province, but federally, in order to have a petition read in the House of Commons, it is different whether you do it on paper versus if you do it digitally. But if you do a petition on paper, you need 25 signatures before it is eligible to be read in front of the House of Commons by your member of parliament. It is a great way to get your issue in front of the members of parliament and to ensure that they are aware of what's happening. And another note is that at each municipal level, there are different titles for what your representative is called. So these slides will be shared later. You guys can have a look. But for example, Ontario is MPP or members of provincial parliament. Quebec is members of National Assembly or MNA. And then BC, for example, has members of Legislative Assembly or MLAs. So if you're seeing different acronyms everywhere, these are part of the reasons why. Um, for advocacy versus lobbying, one of the things to note is that there is compliance obligations, and this differs from depending on what activity you're doing. So, advocacy is general education and public awareness efforts, such as running public-facing campaigns. That's your social media, that's your letter writing campaigns, and so forth. Lobbying is direct engagement with policymakers to influence legislation or policy decisions. Lobbying is communicated with public office holders, or if you're looking at lobbying spreadsheets, what's commonly referred to as a designated public office holder, or a DPOH. Um, for payment with regard to the making, developing, and amending of federal legislative proposals, um, or resolutions, regulations, policies, so forth. So the Federal Lobbying Act defines lobbying as arranging a meeting between a public office holder. And this also applies to consultant lobbyings. And in all levels of government, advocates should be familiar with the legal compliance to lobbying. And there are different obligations related to lobbying in different jurisdictions. At the federal level, the Lobbying Act, the Canadian Lobbying Act, is the legislation outlining compliance issues related to lobbying. But each province and territory, sometimes even the municipalities, will have their own guidance on lobbying. For example, BC has its own lobbying act, but so does Victoria separately. So it's really important to look up where you're lobbying and what the lobbying regulations look like. Some jurisdictions require organization to register as lobbyists if they engage in frequent government lobbying. Some are some have no threshold, some have a threshold of 10 hours, some have a threshold of 10 hours cumulatively across the entire organization. So it depends. If there's 4 people, that would be 2.5 hours each. So it really depends jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but I recommend looking up the Lobbying Act for each province, just so you know and are making sure that everything is above board. During election periods, you must ensure compliance with regulations on political activity and third-party advertising, and this specifically applies to then advocacy because this includes then running digital ads as it relates to your jurisdiction. So one of the things that Action Canada couldn't do was with our campaigning, we couldn't run paid advertising, we couldn't run sponsored posts during election times. Now going on to the environmental scan and partnerships. Consider the following steps that are highlighted. Forming partnerships can bring credibility to your advocacy efforts as they entail showing that you are not alone in your desire for a change. Conducting environmental scans can help you learn what partnership opportunities you can pursue. So really showing that you are not alone, that this is something that affects a significant portion of Canadians, really helps push your asks along. So consider the following steps that are highlighted. Research the existing campaigns and advocacy efforts in your region. For example, with sexual and reproductive health, you might look at Planned Parenthood Toronto. For mental health, these are largely Ontario examples, but for mental health, you might look at CAMH. For supports for newcomers, you might look at the Schleifer Clinic, and they also do work with domestic violence. Identify potential allies, so other organizations, coalitions, student unions, student groups, and ensure alignment in messaging and advocacy when working with partners. And this can entail everyone signing on to one single campaign, or it can involve ensuring alignment across multiple campaigns, ensuring everyone is using the same language and the same definitions across the board. This is one thing that I've certainly noticed, and we've discussed as a sector as well, that there can be different definitions for what domestic violence looks like. There can be different definitions for what reproductive coercion looks like, for example, and ensuring that the coalitions we work with have the same definitions for the terms we are using in front of parliamentarians, I think is of critical importance as well. So now going to when and how to pair behind the scenes government relations with public facing advocacy. Behind the scenes are largely private meetings, policy recommendations, advocacy, advisory work. This is when you're meeting with the parliamentarians, you're not necessarily sharing all of that with the public. The public facing ones would be media advocacy, speaking with journalists, petitions, social media engagement, letter writing campaigns, protests. And if those meetings start to stall, if you're seeing issues with the private meetings, if you're not really getting traction, that's when the public pressure can increase the likelihood of movement. An example I can provide is when Carney had stepped in as prime minister and there was a wartime cabinet. There wasn't a women and gender equity minister announced, for example, and the feminist sector did get together and wrote a letter. We did public-facing campaigns. And in the formal cabinet that was then introduced, there was a women and gender equity minister announced. So it was really important for the sector that that role be maintained. So that's kind of the end of section one. Section two is about learning about key decision makers at the provincial and territorial level to frame advocacy as strategically. So a breakdown of key decision makers and when to engage with them. For premiers and cabinet ministers, they're responsible for setting government priorities and policies. The Minister of Health or the Minister for Women and Gender Equity, if applicable in your provinces, may be key contacts for some of your issues. So whether that is the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Transportation, Public Safety, find your relevant cabinet minister and they would be your key contacts for your advocacy issues. Engaging with the relevant minister rather than with the premier should be your priority. Ministers will be more reachable than premiers. And however, if you believe that the premier is likely to be a champion for your cause, then it may be worth trying to engage with them. But premiers are often focused on one issue, and it is often the people behind the scenes that can be more helpful. So meeting with, at the federal level, for example, the Privy Council's office or the Prime Minister's office, rather than the Prime Minister himself, would be helpful. For cabinet ministers, meeting with file holders at Health Canada rather than the Minister for Health. That is what is most helpful, meeting with the bureaucracy who will remain past election times as well. So if this is something that you think is going to be an ongoing issue, or is this something that you think is going to be an ongoing issue, or is there one specific decision you need now? So with premiers, with cabinet ministers, with opposition party leaders, they will want a concrete ask that they can do so that they can use that during their election times to say, hey, this community came to me and I helped them. Bureaucracy is what is most helpful for longer term projects that will outlast elected officials. Then with opposition party leaders and critics, opposition parties play a crucial role in challenging government policies and can push for changes in legislation and funding commitments. Opposition critics are often referred to as shadow ministers. So, for example, the Conservative Party has a quote unquote shadow cabinet where they will have a shadow minister for each cabinet position that monitors the same files. You can reach out to the staff of opposition parties, including both staff supporting leaders and critics. And then you have the provincial and territorial party offices. So engaging with party staff can help influence party stances. It is particularly important in the lead up to an election as it can influence political platforms. So often, and you see this at the federal level as well, you know who their political strategists are, and being able to secure a meeting with them, for example, could help in influencing their platforms for their elections. And then you have your local representatives, so your MLAs, your MNAs, MPPs, and so on. Contacting your local representative is an asset that can raise issues in the legislature include they can introduce motions or support local advocacy campaigns. If they are in opposition, then they can ask questions about your issue to the government during question period. And if your representative is not part of the opposition party, they can champion your issue to the responsible minister and to their government as a whole. Um, for example, if you know who your MPP, your MLA is for your riding, they will answer your call. One of the examples I often give is for my riding, or for the riding next to me, is Yasser Naqvi. He may not necessarily always want to engage with me on my advocacy issue, but as a person within his riding, he will answer my call for that as my member of parliament. So there are different ways to get to your MPPs. We have a National Youth Advisory Board, and often when they come to Ottawa, we encourage them to reach out to their members of parliament for a meeting so that they can meet with them and let them know what their concerns are as youth. So the reaching out to your local representatives, knowing who they are, having a relationship with their offices is always incredibly beneficial. Um, and then really knowing what policymakers want to hear. So when engaging with policymakers, it's essential to frame your advocacy ask in a way that aligns with their priorities. And the key elements to consider are mandate letters. So in many jurisdictions across Canada, ministers will receive mandate letters outlining their key priorities. Aligning your advocacy with these priorities increases the likelihood of engagement. If your province or territory has mandate letters, then you can find them online. For example, the BC government website lists all of the mandate letters. With Ontario, there was a bit of a discussion around whether those would be made public or not. Federally, for example, we currently have one mandate letter for all cabinet ministers, but tying it into what is in the mandate letters can be helpful in pushing your advocacy ask. Not every province and territory has public mandate letters, and the decision on whether to publicly publish mandate letters is up to each premier and cabinet. Having evidence-based advocacy is also incredibly important. Policymakers are more likely to act if you can provide credible data and real-life stories demonstrating the impact of your issue. Combine narrative with data together to provide factual, emotionally compelling arguments. One of the things that we tend to use is with our access line, keeping it completely anonymous, but saying these are the issues that we're seeing across the board, and these are issues we're seeing within your riding. These are issues we're seeing across Canada. And then being able to show numbers and specific stories. Public and political support is also very important. If there is a public demand for policy change, politicians may be more willing to act. Thus, you want to create a public groundswell of support for your cause. So campaigns, media coverage, petitions, letter writing efforts, and rallies can strengthen your advocacy efforts. A number of news outlets will have their journalist emails publicly available. They'll often put them in their Twitter or X bios, for example, and they're very open to you reaching out to them to saying, hey, I have a story that might be of interest to you. Reach out broadly, and often you will get a bite, even though you may not think so. And then how to monitor, oh, sorry. Yeah, how to monitor provincial governments and legislation. So tracking policy changes is incredibly important. It's a huge part of what I do at Action Canada. And there are many ways for you to track policy changes, including signing up for government newsletters and party press releases, setting up Google alerts, using media monitoring tools, and there are programs that can help you with that, like Meltwater, or even just going through the legislative websites to see what is upcoming. Many of the committee hearings and the question periods will be on CPAC for you to listen into, and those are always helpful. Or the transcripts will be available on the websites after, using a tool called Hansard, and being able to read what parliamentarians are saying, how they're talking about the issues that you care about. Those are of critical importance as well, because then you can frame those as, we heard you talking about this. Here's the parts I think you're missing, or these are the parts that we really loved. Let us help you with this. Those are really helpful because you know they're already talking about the issue you want them to talk about. You're just then stepping in to assist them with language. And once you go to a parliamentarian and say, I can help you, they're always willing to listen. So, how to identify your advocacy objective and create your message. There is a three-part example. So, before engaging with policymakers, these are the questions you want to ask yourself. You must define your advocacy objective. What is it you want to change? So, what specific policy, legislation, or funding change are you seeking? What is your ask? Who has the power to make this change? And what is the clearest and most strategic way to frame your request? With parliamentarians, they often have 5 minutes to give you, and within those 5 minutes, you need to be able to create your message and frame it in a way that is compelling for them to want to give you another 5 minutes, to want to follow up with you. So, how to create your messaging. This is our formula for persuasive messaging that has. Open with shared values to welcome people in across the political spectrum. This is incredibly important, particularly at this time where we're seeing more and more people being shoved onto the sidelines and at the margins. You want to find a way to bring people together. Introduce the problem clearly and simply. Present the solution with a vision for change and conclude with a call to action. So what is it that you want them to do? Give them a one-liner. Um, and then there are often key engagement windows that you want to share. So big ones include the ones that we've listed. And as we've written, advocating at the right time can increase your chances of success as it gives you more leverage as an advocate and helps you seize opportunities. So key engagement windows include provincial and territorial elections. So pre-election, advocate for the policies you want to be included in party platforms. During the elections, engage both local candidates and provincial territorial leaders and parties to ask their positions and use the election window to launch campaigns that mobilize public and political support for your issue. And then following the elections, follow up with the winning party to ensure campaign promises are implemented. You can ask for something to be included in a mandate letter for the jurisdictions that have public mandate letters. You can hold the minister accountable for fulfilling their mandates. Provincial and territorial budgets are also a great time. Budgets are a major opportunity for advocacy, but you must engage at the right time, months ahead of the budget. So to advocate for funding ahead of the budget releases, provinces and territories typically have formal pre-budget engagement processes, which include surveys or consultations, which often are in full swing many months before the budget is revealed. And in some jurisdictions, you can submit written briefs to committees. You can appear before committees to highlight your ask. For the federal government 2 years ago, they had public consultations across Canada with members of the committee going from province to province, and all you had to do was show up for a certain time. This guidance also applies to fall economic statements, which are like mini budgets for cases when these exist. So it's kind of a mid-year check-in almost to discuss what has been spent and what is remaining to be spent. And it's almost a mini budget check-in if there is more funding to then be given during that year as well. It's almost a way for the governments to reevaluate where their budgets lie. Government strategies and consultations are a great way to engage as well. So governments may create policy strategies on certain issue areas such as health, gender equity, housing, mental health, and other issues as well. So, for example, the Manitoba government's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls strategy. That is one that, as it was being developed, there were public calls for consultations as well. And while a strategy is being developed, it's a great time to engage with governments during public consultations and make your vision, your strategies, your community's needs heard. These are opportunities for both public-facing advocacy and behind-the-scenes lobbying. There are often also provincial territorial ministers' meetings. So FPTs or PTs, which are federal, provincial, territorial, or provincial territorial ministers' meetings, are when all of the ministers on a certain issue all meet together to discuss key priorities. An example of this would be the FPT meetings for the Minister of Health's meeting together. Another one was when all of the premiers and the prime minister met a few weeks ago as well. And advocating to your ministers or your premiers before these meetings can influence decisions because it ensures that your issues are talked about at that roundtable. Federal funding and committee meetings are also incredibly important. In a provincial or territorial legislature, committees meet to discuss in greater depth than what debates in legislative chambers allow. And often, if there is an issue or bill that is being passed, it will be referred to the committee in many jurisdictions for a more extensive study before it is brought back for a third reading. So the way bills often go through the legislature are there is a first reading where the bill is introduced, there's a second reading where there's more debate, then it is referred to committee, and then it'll go back to the floor for a third reading and address any amendments that might have occurred. And generally during this time, the committee will have done a study on the bill. So meeting with the committees while they're doing bill studies is always really helpful, or if they're doing studies on any specific topic. For example, currently, the Federal Health Committee is doing a study on how changes in immigration impact the health sector. And part of this is looking at ways to implement foreign doctorate degrees within Canada as well, something that has been an issue for many years. Um, for sometimes committees will also invite residents or experts to participate in the legislative process by testifying at committee. And you can learn about committees for your province or territory on the official government website for your jurisdiction. And you can learn details such as what committees exist, when they meet, broad updates on what they're discussing. You can track what relevant legislation is being considered at committee meetings. In order to increase your chance of being invited to testify at committee meetings, you can build relationships with committee members, which are the provincial elected officials. Finance committees are often tasked with pre-budget engagement ahead of the provincial and territorial budgets. And in some jurisdictions, finance committees are tasked with pre-budget engagement ahead of provincial and territorial budgets as well. So, but finance committees are also often looked at to discuss where the funding for certain bills and legislations will come from. So finance is always a great committee to monitor and engage with, as are committees that will be relevant to each of your specific cases. For example, for me, I engage with a number of the health committees, both in the House of Commons and in the Senate. And then that brings us to section 3, which are practical ways to engage elected officials or policymakers. So, how do you book a meeting with an elected official? Oh, sorry. So, how do you book a meeting with an elected official? How do you find the contact information? Contact details for your representatives are usually available on the government websites. It'll be a general email, and party websites typically also provide contact information related to contacting a political party. So for the House of Commons, for example, it's usually first name dot last name at pearl.gc.ca. This is a general inbox, and then a member from their office will generally contact you. Contact information for bureaucrats and for policymakers can sometimes be more difficult to find, and you may sometimes need to contact a more general email for the department and hope that they will connect you to a more specialized unit. You can also ask members within your networks if they have a direct email address for a policymaker at a certain government unit. And when you do find policymakers' emails, your organizations should save them to keep this as institutional memory, even when you may experience staff turnover. Often, what I tend to do is I will, if I don't have a contact within the office, is send an email to the general account and then follow up the next day or the day after with a phone call to ask if they received the email and just wanting to flag it and ask if there's any updates. This two-pronged approach can make it more timely, can make them respond in a more timely manner because as they receive many emails in their inbox, you've flagged yours specifically, and often you can get an update of, yes, this has been passed on to the scheduling office, or this has been passed on to their assistant, and so on. And then going into email templates. We have some of those as well, and there's some information that'll then be put on the CASSA website, I believe, as well. That'll include this information. So sample emails to request a meeting, for example, what that would look like. I want to discuss XYZ. We're available on this date. Would love to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Thank you so much. Best regards. And then with how to prepare for a meeting. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure why the formatting is off, but we'll continue. How to prepare for a meeting to make sure your efforts lead to the best outcome possible. Adequately preparing yourself and your team for a meeting with a government official is crucial. So part of that is developing an advocacy brief, which serves as a summary of your issue and asks you that you are making during the meeting. It helps you to be strategic and can also be given to the official during or after the meeting. Think of it as a leave behind. An advocacy brief should include a one-page summary of your issue, data and evidence supporting your ask, motivation on why it is aligned with the government's or, if applicable, opposition parties' interests, a clear call to action, and a specific ask. Action Canada has an advocacy brief template, which I've also shared with CASSA, that we can share with all of you as well. So the other aspect is also preparing your elevator pitch. So meeting with elected officials, as I mentioned, can be short and fast-paced. They often can only have 5 minutes of time to give you, and they've booked 3 meetings in the same 30-minute slots, so they're usually running from place to place. Preparing an elevator pitch helps you get your point across with as few words as possible. So start with an emotional connection. If we're looking at contraception, for example, which is a key file I work on, everyone deserves to be able to make decisions about whether and when they have children, which is why contraception must be universally accessible and affordable. Build up the problem. The lack of access to affordable contraception is a major issue in our province. Present the solution and vision. We're calling on the government to fund universal contraception and then make the ask. Will you support this specific initiative and call for funding to be committed to it in the upcoming budget? Another helpful aspect that I had also mentioned previously is bringing constituents to the meeting. Elected officials are more responsive to concerns from their constituents, so bring local supporters if possible. And then anticipating questions and rebuttals. If you want to be as ready as possible to answer any questions, you should think from their point of view. Tactically refute counterarguments, have those prepared, and pivot back to your core messaging during your meeting. Develop your advocacy objective, key messaging, and advocacy brief. Then set aside time to role play with a colleague who can consider potential counterarguments and prepare responses that you're certain your own narrative that you're certain your own narratives and key messages can apply to. So be ready to address financial concerns, feasibility, opposition perspectives, and how we can do that we're about to get into as well. So we won't do this as a breakout session, but this is an exercise that we can engage in together. So thinking like one of these, an NDP premier, a Liberal Minister of Health, a provincial Conservative strategist. What are your top priorities? What is limiting your action? How do you feel about your topic? And what keeps them up at night? So what are their top priorities generally? What is limiting their action on your issue? How do they feel about your topic? And then generally, what are they worried about? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in here. If not, I have certain examples that I can provide as well. So one example I can provide is that an NDP premier, for example, their priority is going to be elected, is getting elected in their riding and ensuring that they have a good number of members in their coalition. Limiting their actions could be funding. For example, for NDP often they do feel strongly about your issue and are often on board. But what keeps them up at night is if they can get people on board with your issue as well, how they're going to continue to maintain their seats, how they're going to continue to maintain their funding. For example, you need 12 members to be considered an official party within government and not be considered independents. NDP currently has 7, which means they've lost research funding, they've lost question period times, they're on fewer committees. Um, those are things that would likely keep an NDP premier up at night, for example. Um, and then another exercise we like to do is policy ask mapping. So in this situation, you want to ground test your ask. So when developing asks, you want to understand how they will be received. Consider what is on the desk of the people you're asking and how your ask will be received. So do the inside their head exercise. What problems does this government slash party have? What is top of mind for the public? What are the stakes of this decision? Evaluate how your asks link up and what kind of solutions are you offering them? Ensure it's political, not just policy. Sorting your asks is a great way to identify what asks to lead with based on the moment. So, best case scenario, what are all of your policy asks? What is funded, what is unfunded, and then see where you can map them accordingly. So, what has the most impact and what is the most feasible? Ideally, you want to be somewhere in that top right corner of something that is a big help and is very likely to happen. That is the ideal situation. We're not often there and end up somewhere in the middle where we want something that's feasible and it may have mid to high impact. So this is a great way of looking at your policy asks and trying to figure out what is impactful and what is feasible. Um, the next one we have is also influence mapping. This is one I love to see, and it's a way to see how networks and identify pathways to influence decision makers. So consider organizations' different roles, experts, conveners, watchdogs, to see the connections, and then look at the level of governments and civil society, business officials, influential people. This is really who you're trying to engage with. So who within your networks already has those connections within government and where they fall on very influential versus not influential, and then where they fall on supportive versus opposed. Who has the ear of the government currently, and where are their stances? And then mapping out like mapping out who has the influence is always very helpful to kind of figure out a way of how to engage. So in the interest of time, I'll leave you with these ones, and then we have our conclusion um, of advocating. So essentially, advocating for any issue at the provincial and territorial level requires strategic engagement, strong messaging and persistence, and by using the tools and strategies outlined in this presentation and also in our advocacy toolkit, local organizations can influence policy and create meaningful change. So for further guidance, you're welcome to reach out to Action Canada and join the National Movement for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights in Canada. But also we have this resource hub that is specific to sexual and reproductive health and rights, but can loosely be applied to many advocacy issues. So the template can be reused, how to make an ask can be reused, and then we do have the page of how to partner with Action Canada. We have policy expertise, we have training, capacity buildings, and we have connections to national SRHR and adjacent networks, so women's health, migrant rights networks, and such. And that leaves us about 10 minutes for a quick Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Insiya, for such a insightful presentation. And now we will open up the floor for Q&A. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or raise your hands.
I'm also just going to share a short survey that if all of you could fill out after the workshop, it's super helpful for us as well. So we can know where to improve and such.
Yeah, Melissa, go ahead.
Hi, that was really, really, really valuable information. I'm wondering if you could share an example where you've kind of gone through all of those steps, and also what challenges are you seeing right now in terms of messaging around sexual health, and how are you guys responding to uh, conflict or backlash or you know, um differences of opinion?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it is a very critical time right now, and I think the way Action Canada sees it is this is when our work needs to ramp up, particularly in the face of funding decreases, in the face of backlash. This is when our presence is more important than ever. One example of when we went through this was particularly around the elections. One of the campaigns that we ran was a campaign called Demand Better, where I'm sure all of you have noticed there seems to be this false dichotomy that's coming up around whether you want funding for community issues and services or whether you want funding for national defense. And the priority right now, unfortunately, has to be national defense. The campaign we ran was to flag that this isn't true. You can have healthy communities, and healthy communities are part of national security as well. In order for your population to be secure, they need to have access to health, they need to have access to housing, they need to have access to food, education. Those things don't change because you're facing threats on your borders. So that was an example of a time that we did the thinking like exercise of um, how would how would the candidates feel about these issues? What are their talking points? Who has their ear? What asks are we doing that are most impactful? One of the asks we had was continued funding for women and gender equity, and for women's rights organizations, and that has come, but one of the issues that we're seeing is that the funding cycles haven't been made clear yet. So we know there's money earmarked, for example, um, but how that happens is continues to be seen. So that's an example of one of the things that we saw. But I think those are some of the issues that we're seeing that I'm not sure if you heard a few weeks ago there was Carney's speech where he was asked about the feminist international assistance policy, and he said he wouldn't classify it as feminist, but it stays with those principles. So areas like that where you're seeing kind of a move away from that language. They don't want to use the words feminist, for example. And they don't want to focus on these issues. Largely, they're saying in order for Canadians to be okay, we need to look at national defense. We need to look at amping up our CMP. And now is the time when our organizations are saying, actually, in order for safety, you need to be able to have a roof over your head. You need to be able to have access to education, access to housing, access to food, and have access to reproductive and sexual health. You like the sexual health clinics need to be able to stay open. These lines need to be able to stay clear. Another issue we're working on is also the FPIH funding, which is FIHP, I apologize, funding, which is the Federal Interim Health Program for newcomers, and how it is affected when people don't have full access to healthcare. So those are some of the issues that we're seeing. I also saw a question from Nasser in the chat on how we can sign up for government newsletters. Those will be on the legislative website. So whether you want to follow a specific committee, whether you want to receive newsletters as a whole, there'll be a sign up link for your provinces on their websites. And often, if you just look up Legislative Assembly of Ontario, for example, newsletter, that'll come up often as well.
Thank you so much, Insiya, for sharing your expertise. We have one more question. Please, can you share the specific names of the organizations to follow for tracking?
Yeah, so the organizations I look at, so there's a number of newsletters that go out from political correspondents. So one of them is David Aiken, for example, for humanitarian aid. I also follow Don's Digest. Um, and there's openpearl.gc.ca, which does all of the so it kind of does immediate updates on what is happening in the House of Commons. These are, and then they officiate it afterwards through the Hansard documents. They it's more of a transcript that comes immediately, and then Hansard will take about 7 to 10 days often to get updated with the official debate transcripts. I also follow I have a number of newsletters that come from the House of Commons itself. So I've signed up for a number of committees that I monitor, for example, health, status of women. They'll have updates that you can sign up to, so you know what's happening on a case-by-case basis, like what study they're doing, who the witnesses are for the study. For example, often if there's like the Minister for Women and Gender Equity appearing in front of the Status of Women Committee, that can be a really great opportunity if you have a connection with a member on the committee to ask a question. Similarly with international development, which is another area of work that we focus on. So those are some of the newsletters I sign on to. It's also really helpful to set up Google alerts for certain, for example, the committees. That can often get cumbersome because you are wading through a number of alerts, but it is helpful in case there is a news story that you want to be tracking.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone for any question? We have 3 more minutes, so please feel free to ask any question.
Insiya, I have a question.
Yeah, that's great. Jessica, go ahead.
Um, can we reach out to Action Canada for like very specific support if we are in the middle of a campaign and we want to get some guidance? Is that a possibility?
Yes, of course. Action Canada is always happy to help. And we have connections with adjacent networks as well. So, for example, what might be helpful for this group is we have connections with the Canadian Council for Refugees. We have connections with the Migrants' Rights Network, and they often have good connections on housing and immigration and newcomer supports and such as well. So Action Canada is always happy to help, whether that's through me or whether that's through our general information account. That is very frequently checked, and then we will get back to you as soon as we can.
That's very good to know. And this was a great presentation. A lot of great resources. I'm glad that this would be on a website and will help a lot of people that were not able to attend today.
Great, and I'm so happy to help. And we do have the resource hub that I've shared as well. And we'd love for all of you to be able to use that. It does have templates for advocacy briefs and for letter writing campaigns and such as well.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's session. And I hope you found it informative and it has added to your knowledge and strengthened your advocacy efforts. The recording, the presentation slides, and the relevant resources will be shared via email before the end of this week. And thank you once again for your time and engagement. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. If any other questions come up, please feel free to send them along to me.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.